This is not the story of Seattle, nor is this a television show. This is rather a chronicle, a catalog of glimpses from Seattle's past arranged in order of time. Or what follows might be compared to suddenly receiving hundreds of postcards, with the earliest postmark from 1851, the year that the first permanent residents landed at Alki Point and settled in the Duwamish Valley. And the most recent card would be this one, sent 90 years later. Here, artfully displayed within the letters that spell Seattle, are the landmarks that tourists of this town in the eve of the Second World War would have considered to be the city's significant sites. A half-century ago, these were the sensations. S frames the highest building in the West. E envelops the locks, second only to those in Panama. A contains one of the engineering wonders of the Pacific Coast Highway. And T holds America's most majestic mountains seen above Lake Washington, and also the bridge that amazingly floats on that lake. L frames the ritual totem of an ancient people, and E includes a waterfall higher than Niagara, though not as wide. These are the landmarks many of us grew up with, and with the exception of the bridge that no longer floats, they all survive, and most of them continue to be promoted as tourist attractions. For tourists or welcome strangers, Seattle is filled with exotic and picturesque surprises. For those of us who live here, however, it is quite a different place. Profoundly familiar, it is painted with our memories. Still, there's a third Seattle, which is neither familiar nor strange, but both at once. This is the city past, the Seattle you are about to explore, visiting lost landmarks in the twilight zone of your own TV. It may change your life in Seattle. And finally, don't be alarmed by the speed with which all this proceeds. These 2 hours are only a glimpse into a subject you may enter more thoroughly with books. And as with a book here, please remember, yours is the power to page forward or back or close the covers whenever you wish. You may even choose to return it. So let us begin, but not in Seattle, in Portland. Here in October 1851, a collection of mostly Midwestern farmers, exhausted after months on the Oregon Trail, waited for word from Puget Sound. Usually identified as the Denny Party after their young but stern and steadfast leader Arthur Denny, the group waited for instructions from Arthur's younger brother David, a teenager who had gone ahead with John Lowe, another of the party, to examine Puget Sound. Impressed by the potential of this beach, the natives called Smugwamux, and by the promontory at its western end, from which you could look up and down the Sound, John Lowe left David Denny to build a cabin on Alki Beach, while he returned to Portland with David's terse message, quote, "We have examined the valley of the Duwamish River and find it fine country. There is plenty of room for 1,000 settlers. Come at once." And they did. Aboard the schooner Exact, 23 of them, 10 adults and 13 children. The youngest, Roland Denny, only 8 weeks old. They arrived at Alki Point on November 13th, 1851. Many of them seasick, and all of them drenched. The diorama of that landing at the Museum of History and Industry shows the roofless cabin, unfinished since David hacked his foot while building it. The lame teenager greets his future bride, Louisa Boren. Arthur Denny is depicted carrying his tripod, but not for photography. There are no snapshots of this landing, but for surveying the native land into saleable sections. It was an instrument the Indians who camped near the cabin might have done well to purloin. Instead, they fed the baby Roland with nutritious clam nectar and helped the Denny party survive its first winter on the Sound. There are several sketches of the completed cabin, but only one photograph, and that of it as a wreck and once again roofless. This original Seattle structure was regrettably destroyed in 1891. 2 years earlier, in 1889, David Denny built another cabin as a real estate office from which the then 57-year-old pioneer sold what unbought lots remained on his platted claim in Lower Queen Anne, acres that now include Seattle Center. 1 block away, David and Louisa also built their first mansion at the corner of Temperance Avenue, the Denny's were teetotalers, and Mercer Street, named for their neighbor, Tom Mercer. It was also their last mansion. The economic crash of 1893 left them bankrupt. The cabin, also on Temperance, was much later converted into a tavern. Fittingly, by then, Temperance had been renamed Queen Anne Avenue. In 1966, it was carefully disassembled and replaced by another steep-roofed oddity, this one for marketing pancakes with cosmopolitan names like Vive la French Toast. The Queen Anne cabin was packed out of town to Federal Way to lend some pioneer aura to a then-new shopping mall, which soon went bankrupt. The cabin, however, survives. 11 years after the 1891 destruction of Denny's original cabin on Alki Beach, a chicken dinner house was built in its place. It was named the Stockade Resort after the vertical timbers gathered from the beach for its construction. There, on a cool November 13th, 1905, or exactly 54 years since the original Alki landing, and 2 years since David Denny's demise, a respectful crowd assembled to dedicate a monument commemorating the first settlers. David's brother-in-law, Carson Bourne, was there, as well as Bourne's sister, Arthur Denny's wife, Mary, and her boy, Roland, who was but a babe at the original landing. Since then, this first Founders' Day, the pylon has been moved across Alki Avenue from the apartment house, which has replaced the landmark stockade. In early February of 1852, Arthur Denny, Carson Bourne, and William Bell examined the east shore of Elliott Bay, and on the 15th of that month, they staked their claims there. They were soon joined first by Doc Maynard and later Henry Esler, and adjusted their claims to let them in. Carson Bourne's cabin was the first built at the new settlement. William Bell later purchased Bourne's cabin and its lot and replaced the cabin with a finished home. The Bells moved from their claim at what is now the Belltown part of the Denny regrade to be nearer the little settlement that was collecting about Yesler's steam sawmill. A plaque fixed to the Hogue building at 2nd and Cherry commemorates the spot of Bourne's cabin and later Bell's home. 11 years before Bourne put up his cabin, the U.S. voyage of exploration, led by Lieutenant John Wilkes, drew the first recognizable map of Elliott Bay. Across the bay from the West Seattle Peninsula was a smaller promontory, which Wilkes named Piner's Point, after Thomas Piner, a quartermaster on the expedition. 11 years later, Piner's Point became part of Doc Maynard's claim and developed into the commercial heart of pioneer Seattle. Its southern limit was King Street. It was on Piner's Point, somewhere near King Street, that the pioneer Isaac Eby came ashore in 1850, 1 year before the Alki landing, and was invited by the Duwamish chief Seattle to enter the native longhouse and witness their dances and chants, celebrating the salmon's return to Elliott Bay. The point's proximity to the Duwamish River, and yet beyond its shallow estuary and tidelands, made this relatively flat protuberance appealing to both the natives and the settlers. The latter then took it, first outright and then by treaty. What community land the natives ultimately got in return was this pile of rubble, brought here as ballast to balance otherwise empty ships and dropped here to take on usually either coal or logs. Appropriately, this mainland was called Ballast Island. Thus, the Indians, for whom the shores of Elliott Bay were native land for thousands of years, were made to camp just offshore on strange land, imported from Australia, Hawaii, and Europe, and especially from San Francisco, the busy clutter of its harbor seen here in 1851. San Francisco was a voracious consumer of Northwest lumber and coal. Here in 1880, we see the beginnings of Ballast Island. Rubble poured from the wharf at the foot of Washington Street. 12 or 13 years later, that pile has grown into a mound with its mixed society of native camps and besuited Indian gawkers. Ballast Island is photographed here from the shoreline, looking west to the pier sheds of the Oregon Improvement Company. The roofline of its pier between Main and Washington Street is repeated in the painting by P.A. Morgan, another shoreside view. From the water, or actually from the long King Street coal wharf, the native camps were ordinarily hidden except at low tide when the bright canvas of their tents could be seen above the steamers lying temporarily low. Eventually, all of Ballast Island was hidden beneath the planking of Railroad Avenue, which was itself partially topped in 1919 by the elevated municipal trolley to West Seattle, and again in 1951 by the Alaska Way Viaduct, which was opened first to photographers before vehicles. Ballast Island, then, was largely a creation of the 1880s and early 90s, and appears on few, if any, maps, certainly not the first map of Elliott Bay, which names it Seattle Harbor. The 1854 U.S. Coast Survey depicts the then 2-year-old settlement as a few spots dappling the peninsula, which 13 years earlier Wilkes named Piners Point. One of these dots is Yesler's Mill, which, when it opened a year earlier in 1853, was the first steam sawmill on Puget Sound. It was the lumber from Yesler's Mill that gave that finished look to the Felker House, the community's first hotel, on Jackson Street. The hotel was built in 1853, and the following year Yesler's lumber gave Methodist minister David Blaine and his wife Catherine the material to build the rough community's first spiritual rostrum, the White Church at 2nd and Columbia, and the parsonage beside it where Catherine Blaine taught school. Charles and Elander Plummer's home was constructed of Yesler's millwork in 1855 at the northeast corner of Jackson and Occidental. It was the community's first fine home. Of course, all of these photos are from later years. The first detailed map of the new community dates from 1856. Highlighted here, the basic peninsular shape of Piners Point includes marks for most of the small community's structures, including the Felker Hotel on Jackson. The future corner of Occidental and Washington was still set in a tide marsh. The Navy Lieutenant Thomas Stowell Phelps, who drew this map, also sketched this panorama of the city from aboard the Navy sloop of war Decatur, which was, fortunately for the settlers, anchored offshore during the Battle of Seattle. Phelps' somewhat crude sketch is given a sophisticated rendering by contemporary marine artist Hewlett Jackson. The prominence of the Felker Hotel is evident. Now, if we put the sketch and the map together, we get something like this oblique bird's eye, also a recent cartoon. We see the Plummer and Felker structures on Jackson, the tide marsh, and if we move in closer, Yesler's Mill, and a bridge for those highest tides that made Piners Peninsula something like Piners Island. The bridge was built on what is now First Avenue South between Yesler Way and Washington Street. Returning to the Jackson sketch, north of the bridge is Yesler's Mill, the White Church at 2nd and Columbia, and most importantly, the blockhouse on the knoll at the foot of Cherry Street. Phelps wrote near the top of his map, "The woods were thronged with Indians," and on the morning of February 26, 1856, the Navy's howitzer sent a shell into those woods, and the natives answered, raining small arms fire down on the peninsular settlement. 2 of the settlers were killed. Neither the number of bellicose natives nor their casualties has ever been confidently estimated. The settlers who were not already in the blockhouse fled to it. This dramatic moment was painted later by Emily Inez Denny, David and Louisa's first child, who was 3 years old at the time of the Battle of Seattle. Emily is here on the right beside David, who holds her sister Madge Decatur Denny. Madge was born in the blockhouse, and both she and the fort were named after Phelps' sloop of war, the Decatur, which Emily includes in her painting. David and Louisa's cabin on their claim was one of the few homes which were not sacked and burned by the natives during their retreat from the Decatur's barrage. After the Indian War, the family returned to their acres and built a farmhouse with a large garden at what is now the lawn beside the Seattle Center's International Fountain. The Denny's old garden, which helped feed pioneer Seattle, is now used for a variety of celebrations and exercises. Catherine and David Maynard, close friends of Chief Seattle, were so disheartened by the war and some of the settlers' treatment of the natives that they traded most of their Piners Point claim with Charles Terry, another of the Denny party, and fled the community for the settlement's original acres on Alki Point. There the Maynards built this home sometime before they returned to Seattle in 1863 to open the town's first hospital. In 1868, the Maynards sold their Alki Point home to brothers-in-law Knud Olsen and Martin Hans Hansen, the latter an ancestor to Ivar Hagelin, Seattle's recently deceased folk singer and restaurateur. Ivar collected rents on the old Maynard home during the Depression. At some point, the Maynard home was shortened and moved a block off Alki Beach, where today it survives as the oldest structure in the city. With E.A. Clark, Seattle gets its first citizen with a camera, and so also, at last, its first photograph. A 1859 record of Sarah and Henry Yesler's home at the northeast corner of First and James. Sarah poses on the front porch, and note Yesler's elevated flume descending down James Street from the springs in the forest beyond 3rd Avenue. About 1 year later, Clark took another daguerreotype of the Yesler home. The structure has been widened some, and the elevated hydraulics have been dismantled. The flume is gone, probably replaced by board logs buried beneath James Street. An elevated water flume was also used by Charles Plummer to service ships at his pier here at the foot of Main Street, and also for his Snoqualmie Hall. Here on July 22, 1859, Seattle threw its first supper and ball for the women and mostly single men of Puget Sound. More than 200 attended. The regional 10-to-1 ratio of men to women was heroically addressed by young Asa Mercer, who arrived here in 1861 and was promptly made first president of Seattle's territorial prize, the University of Washington, which, to meet a territorial deadline, was quickly built in 1861 and received by the legislature on Christmas Eve. Mercer went east twice, and on both adventures returned by sea and the Isthmus of Panama with women. Of the 9 Mercer girls, as they were called, who first returned with him in 1864, 8 married local bachelors. The exception, Liz Ordway, later became the first teacher at Central School, Seattle's first public school, which was built in 1870 at 3rd and Madison, now the site of the Seafirst Tower. 5 years earlier, the city's first panorama was made by the community's first professional photographer, E.M. Samus. It looks north up First Avenue, then called Commercial Street, from the roof of the Snoqualmie Hall at Main, the site now of the Bread of Life mission, from whose 3rd floor this repetition of Samus's scene was recorded only 127 years later. As the first wide view of the city, the Samus panorama is the most significant photograph ever made of the city. In it, the line of First Avenue points to the University building on the horizon. On the scene's far left are Denny Hill and First Avenue just above high tide at Marion Street. And on the right, Charles Terry's home at 3rd and James, now the site of the Public Safety Building. The Occidental Hotel opened this year, 1865. It was instantly the finest hotel on Puget Sound. Facing Pioneer Place, 1 block east of First Avenue, its front porch in line with its namesake, Occidental Avenue. Samus's studio faced Yesler Way. The skylight on the studio's roof shed a northerly light upon his subjects, including Chief Seattle. Samus's portrait of the old chief with his eyes closed has been rendered countless times since, often with the chief's eyes retouched open. The chief has also been redressed in a variety of commercial costumes. The Sam of Seattle was also sculpted by James Wen for the old horse trough at Pioneer Square, photographed here with a white cap from the big snow of 1916. And here much later in contemporary photographer Mary Randlett's portrait, in which the Pioneer Square totem peaks between the chief and Northwest historian totem Murray Morgan. 1 year after the chief climbed the steps to Sammis's studio, he died across the Sound at Agate Pass in Old Man's House, a 500-foot-long structure of which this long beam was its last recorded remnant. The chief, a Catholic convert, was buried nearby in the Squamish Cemetery, since then the site for the annual blessings of Chief Seattle Day. Eventually, the chief's gravesite became an attraction. More recently, Seattle's Christian gravestone has been surrounded by a cedar frame supporting native canoes, symbolizing perhaps an eternal struggle for the chief's soul between its indigenous and imported sources. Another casualty of 1866 was Yesler's cookhouse, the cedar-planked big room used for weddings, trials, lectures, religious services, as well as kitchen and dining room for the mill workers. Since the city's Great Fire of 1889, the old cookhouse corner has been filled by the Mutual Life Building. Visitors to the city's 4th of July celebration of 1868 were welcomed with this arch facing Elliott Bay from Yesler Way. To the left is Yesler's home, and to the right the Occidental Hotel, where, after speeches, races, and a parade, the guests attended a supper and a grand ball, followed by fireworks. 1869 was the first real boom year on Puget Sound. The Central Pacific Railroad was completed to San Francisco, and the Northern Pacific was surveying Snoqualmie Pass. There were 10,000 men within 50 miles of the city, practically all of them logging. So after timber, booze, and bordellos were the most profitable Seattle enterprises. Town lots selling at $50 in January were getting $500 in late summer, and Seattle was at last incorporated. The prosperity of '69 helped reopen the university, which was closed in '68 for lack of students. From the university's bell tower, the view due west across 3rd Avenue reveals a still decidedly rural scene. And a 1871 painting of Seattle from the bay also shows off these open spaces. By now, the timber has been cut back to 5th or 6th Avenue. The community's second church, the Methodist Protestant or Brown Church, is here at 2nd and Madison, and the side-wheeler Olympia is also on the scene, but not for long. She was soon sent back to San Francisco after losing a rate war with the slightly faster steamer North Pacific, seen here much later at the foot of Jackson Street. Another side-wheeler, the Alida, was completed in Seattle in the summer of 1870. The scene's landmarks include, again, Central School, the University, and the Brown Church. Trinity Church, the town's first Episcopal congregation, was opened in 1870 at 3rd and Jefferson. Also that year, Father Prefontaine dedicated Our Lady of Good Help at 3rd in Washington. This, the first Roman Catholic church in Seattle, is included in the same 1871 painting. And that may be the side-wheeler Alida heading out from Yesler's Wharf with Yesler's steam sawmill above the side-wheeler's stack. The 1870 census counted 1,100 residents, making Seattle the 3rd largest community in the territory after Olympia and Walla Walla. Beginning in 1872, East Side coal was barged by way of Lakes Washington and Union to a narrow-gauged railway at the south end of Lake Union, and from there hauled to a coal wharf at Pike Street. The rails on Pike Street can be detected in this view from Denny Hill, which, when shown whole, also includes the University building on Denny Knoll. When the Pike Street coal wharf was improved in 1875 to the grand dimensions shown here, 70 feet high and more than 200 feet long, it was easily the largest structure on Puget Sound. Coal was then Seattle's principal industry and a resource important in its competition with the smaller and newer community on Commencement Bay, its founders named after the Aboriginal name for Mount Rainier. This is Tacoma in 1872, 1 year before it was chosen by the Northern Pacific for the railroad's Puget Sound port. The railroad's choice of Tacoma over Seattle was tersely announced in this telegram to Arthur Denny. It reads simply, "We have located terminus on Commencement Bay." Within a year, the citizens of Seattle set about building their own railroad. Its name, the Seattle and Walla Walla, indicated an intent to reach the territory's wheat capital, Walla Walla, through Snoqualmie Pass. The inventive and disciplined Scotsman John Coleman was responsible for completing the line to its real target, the coal fields of Renton and Newcastle. The only surviving construction scene is of a pile driver beginning work on the trestle that would carry the narrow-gauge railroad across Elliott Bay and into the new King Street coal wharf, which, when it was completed in 1878, took into its bunkers the coals of Newcastle. This 1879 bird's eye reveals how the new system dominated the southern shore of Old Piners Point. 1 year later, the new coal wharf was used as a platform to photograph the still forested horizon of Beacon Hill, and on the same day, turning 90 degrees north, the old Pike Street coal wharf below Denny Hill, which had been considerably degraded by worms and weather in the only 2 years since it was abandoned. In 1876, while Coleman's crews were approaching Renton, the Territorial University at last graduated its first class. She was Clara McCarty of Puyallup, who received her Bachelor of Science diploma. Also in 1876, the Arlington House opened on First South. At that time, it was the largest hotel in Washington Territory. The Arlington sat at the southwest corner of First and Main. This view north of First from Main also dates from that year, 1876. The evidence is this work in progress on the tower of First Presbyterian Church, constructed this year at the southeast corner of 3rd and Madison, although seen here much later in 1890. With an expanded tax base after the '69 incorporation and a modest but steady rise in population, public works began in earnest. The 1876 regrade of First Avenue, north of Yesler Way, was easily the largest improvement undertaken to that time. This view of the shoreline from the end of Yesler's Wharf shows the rough condition of First Avenue in 1869. Here, First tilts and rolls up and down along the waterfront, with swells like at Marion Street and depressions like at Madison. The same point of view, 9 years later, in 1878, reveals in the strong mid-afternoon light the timber cribbing holding up First at its new and even grade. The regrade extended to Pike Street, and the northern end of that public work, with its smooth climb to the western slopes of Denny Hill, is shown here, again in 1878, from the end of Yesler's Wharf. A contemporary view of this stretch of the waterfront from near the same location is consistently interrupted by the gray bulk of the Alaska Way Viaduct. Looking north now on First from Cherry Street, again in 1878, the front hump of Denny Hill spans the horizon. Now if we leap, as it were, to the top of Denny Hill and look north just 4 years later, in 1882, towards Lake Union, this is what we would see. A landscape selectively cleared of its best timber by loggers, some of whom worked for David Denny's Western Mill, which that year was constructed at the south end of Lake Union, in a neighborhood which was soon cleared for development. Obviously, however, there are still trees to cut at the north end of Capitol Hill, on the right and across the lake in the forests of the future Wallingford. Now the old prospect of Denny Hill has been lowered 100 feet, and the lake lost behind apartments and business blocks. Now, making an about face and looking back at the city in 1878, the wide tide flats below the still forested Beacon Hill are crossed by only the trestle of the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad, which curves its way to the new King Street coal wharf. This side of the coal wharf, the commerce packed on Yesler's Wharf, dominated the city's waterfront activity. Panning to the left a short distance, we come upon a waterfront oddity, the Hulk of the Windward, which after it ran aground in Useless Bay off Whidbey Island in 1875, was towed to the waterfront and used by James Coleman as a storehouse and by swimmers as a diving platform. This useful wreck was an enduring feature on the waterfront and was never removed, lying today beneath Western Avenue near Columbia Street. The 1878 prospect from Denny Hill also includes, from its north side, the Carpenter Gothic home of Arthur and Mary Denny at First and Union. From its front porch, overlooking Elliott Bay, the Denny clan could forecast the weather, name the ships approaching port, or gather for the parades on First Avenue, then the city's preferred parade route. Here we look north from Madison Street. Here south, again from Madison, and again in 1878. That year the city's directory claimed that 5 out of every 6 Seattle men smoked and 9 of every 10 drank. Statistics encouraging, no doubt, to the North Pacific Brewery and Peter's Furs Cigars and Liquors, both establishments on Front Street. In the foreground is A.W. Piper. Piper was the town's favorite candy maker, cartoonist, practical joker, and the first socialist on the city council. Beside him is his son Wallace. This year Piper's city council passed an ordinance prohibiting livestock from the streets and sidewalks, but obviously not dogs like Jack here, the Piper's mutt. The catalogue of 1879 must begin with Henry Villard, the journalist turned capitalist, who this year added to his Oregon Improvement Company the narrow-gauge Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad and the East Side coal mines. Soon Villard brought in ocean-going ships to haul the community's coal, its people, and the growing inventory of products manufactured locally. Also in 1879, the side-wheeler George E. Starr was launched near the foot of Cherry Street. At 154 feet, she was to then the largest vessel built on Puget Sound, and when she retired in 1911, about 8 years after this view of her was photographed, the Starr was the last side-wheeler on Puget Sound. Also in 1879, Henry Yesler's second mill on his wharf was destroyed by fire. 3 years earlier, a financially strapped Yesler tried to raffle his mill in a lottery, which the state Supreme Court found illegal only after Henry had helped himself considerably by selling a few thousand tickets. Yesler's wharf also suffered a few collapses beneath the big snow of 1880, still the city's deepest. This view was shot from the back of the Peterson Brothers studio at the foot of Cherry Street. The Petersons also recorded the snowscape up Cherry Street wisely from the front of their studio, not the street, for, as the Intelligencer then reported, the average citizen walks nowadays as though he were drunk. This is the look up Cherry from First only 31 years later. Through the 1870s, as coal became king on Seattle's waterfront, the city grew from a population of less than 1,000, as we see it here in 1869, to the 3,533 counted in the 1880 census, when this scene was recorded from the King Street coal wharf looking north over Yesler's wharf without the sawmill, which is still not rebuilt since the fire of the year before. 3,533 was only 55 fewer than Walla Walla, which it surpassed within 2 years to become the territory's largest community. Seattle was the financial and manufacturing center on Puget Sound. It was also its entertainment center. Much of the city's revenues were got from fines and licenses on booze, gambling, and prostitution, a source which continued well into the 20th century, interrupted by the occasional short-lived reform. The Kalmar Hotel at 6th and James was built in 1881. In this turn-of-the-century view of it, a James Street cable car ascends to its powerhouse on Broadway. Remarkably, the Kalmar survived until it was razed for the construction of the Seattle Freeway. Like the Kalmar, the West Point Lighthouse was also built in 1881. It, of course, survives. On September 27, 1881, a memorial service for the assassinated President James Garfield was held in front of the Occidental Hotel on Pioneer Place, now called Pioneer Square. It was also the first day in town for Reginald Thompson, this future city engineer who would later change the city more than any politician. Thompson was impressed by the, quote, profound attention the crowd paid the addresses. The future city engineer also noted that Seattle seemed to be set in a hole, referring to the hills, and mused that someday he might dig it out, and as we will soon see, he tried. In 1883, the triangle in front of the Occidental Hotel, where Thompson and the crowd gathered to remember Garfield, was filled with the new brick Occidental Hotel, thereby beginning the transformation of the city's business district from frame construction to brick and stone. All of these views look east, up Yesler Way, across First Avenue, when it still jogged around the Yesler-Leary building on the left. This unlucky scene was photographed on June 5, 1889. By bedtime the following night, Pioneer Square was reduced to rubble and a few ruins by the Great Fire, which destroyed more than 30 city blocks. The Pioneer Square, built promptly after the fire, was a dignified collection of mostly Romanesque brick and granite piles, with the Flatiron Seattle Hotel its centerpiece. This neighborhood was in danger of being razed during the generally architecturally dismal age of the late 50s and early 60s. The rundown condition of Pioneer Square was an alluring field to the forces of urban renewal. In 1961, the Seattle Hotel was destroyed and replaced by this garage, popularly known as the Sinking Ship, which its developers assured the city's Arts Commission would repeat Pioneer Square's design elements. They were apparently referring to the basket-handle ironwork on the garage's roof, which is still a lifeless parody of the windows in the Pioneer Building, which was Henry Esler's last production before his death in 1892. The hotel's destruction invigorated the forces of preservation and saved most of this historic district from the hotel's fate. Of the many views of Seattle made from Beacon Hill, this is the earliest survivor. Photographed in 1882, it shows the curving trestle of the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad leading to what is still a peninsula south of Yesler Way. In 1882, the central business district is still a modest skyline, and in the distance the Magnolia Peninsula is as yet densely forested. Here, 17 years later, in 1899, the tides can still reach the shores of Beacon Hill, and the clutter of development has ascended First Hill, where 64 years later, the block-wide swath of the Seattle Freeway has punched its way through. In 1868, Seattle's cityscape began its imitation of the modern international skyline with the construction of the Seafirst Tower. Now that black box, as it was called, is merely one face in a crowd of steel, glass, and polymers, dominated by the Columbia Center, on which construction was begun in 1982. 99 years earlier, that is, returning to 1883, that year the Transcontinental Northern Pacific was completed, and although to Tacoma, not to Seattle, it was still celebrated here as well. Henry Villard, who had taken control of the railroad, was given a grand welcome, courted and dined by the locals in hopes that he would promptly extend the NP line into Seattle, where he already had, the locals reasoned, many investments and so interests. And Villard might have responded had he not, shortly after his visit to Seattle, lost control of the railroad with the crash of 1883. Earlier that summer, Sarah and Henry Yesler had decorated their home, not for the Villards, but for Independence Day. Henry, as we see him here, had developed the habit of whittling on any occasion, including a public hanging, caricatured here in the cartoonist candymaker Piper's cartoon of the 1882 lynching of two desperate characters accused of murdering a local businessman named Reynolds. A third man, found guilty of an earlier murder, was also strung from a puncheon propped in the maples on the James Street side of the Esler home. This view looks west from 2nd Avenue. The crossbar was left in those trees for years after as a warning, but hardly a preventative against the inevitable transformation of Seattle from a city of familiars to one also of strangers, some of them dangerous. Also in 1883, 2 blocks up James Street, behind the Eslers' old home, construction began on what would be their truly big home. It was not until 1886, however, that they moved into their mansion, seen here in the 1890s beyond City Hall. Sarah died the following year, in 1887, and Henry in 1892. In 1899, the Seattle Public Library moved in. The occupancy was appropriate, for Sarah Yesler had been the public library's first librarian in 1868. On New Year's Eve, 1901, the library was destroyed by fire, taking 25,000 volumes with it. Another of the library's founders, the railroad lawyer James McNaught, moved into his grand home on 4th in 1883. 5 years later, it was the first quarters for the Rainier Club. Eventually, in 1904, the club dedicated its own building 1 block south on 4th at Marion Street. Eventually, the McNaught Mansion was moved across Spring Street to make room for construction of the city's new Carnegie Library, which opened in 1906. Only 2 years later, 4th Avenue was regraded and lowered, thereby requiring the addition of a grand new entrance to the library. Here, the moved McNaught Mansion is also evident above the library's new front steps. In 1957, the Carnegie Library was destroyed and replaced by the Central Library's less imposing but more efficient modern plant. When James McNaught was first building his big home on 4th, the Sisters of Providence were completing the first wing of their hospital behind him on 5th Avenue. Also that spring of 1883, the new Central School was opened nearby at 6th and Madison. It was then the largest school in the territory. Its bell tower was an impressive prospect from which to look in all directions, like this mid-1880s view from its tower north to Lake Union, which can be compared to a contemporary glimpse from nearly the same place a century later. This view of both Providence Hospital and the high school was taken from the top of the Territorial University only days before Central School was burned to the ground in April 1888. It was soon replaced by this brick pile, which was then easily the most imposing structure in town. When Denny's School was opened in 1884 at the northeast corner of Battery Street and 5th Avenue, it was decidedly in the sticks of North Seattle. The school survived until 1928, when it was lost to the last of the Denny regrades. The Denny School alumni then moved its cupola to nearby Denny Park, Seattle's first park, which was given to the city by David and Louisa Denny in 1884, the year Denny School was opened nearby. The city's first charity, the Ladies' Relief Society, was also formed in 1884, and 2 years later opened its Seattle Children's Home on the site of what is now Seattle Center's Food Circus. Later, the home was relocated on Queen Anne Hill, where it still resides. In 1884, women briefly had suffrage in Washington state. After holding a convention in an apple orchard at 5th and Marion, Seattle's newly enfranchised women elected a reform mayor and city council. Seattle's horse cars began running in 1884. Their rails led from Pioneer Square up 2nd Avenue here to Pike, where they turned west to 1st and continued a route which led to Belltown, where in 1883 William Bell, one of the city's original settlers at Elki Point, opened his Bellevue Hotel. Later his son, Austin Bell, developed plans for a 5-story brick monolith beside it, which, after the 35-year-old Austin committed suicide in 1889, was finished by his wife Eva and named for him. Although in disrepair, the Austin Bell building is protected as a landmark and stands across 1st from the waterfront entrance of the Battery Street Tunnel, the site of the pioneer Bell family's first cabin. In 1885, real estate developer Martin Van Buren Stacy and his wife Elizabeth watched their second Empire mansion on 3rd Avenue take its decidedly elegant shape. Many locals still remember it, for the Stacy mansion survived until 1960, when its last occupant, the Maison Blanc restaurant, was gutted by fire. The Stacys did not move into their oversized mansion until 1887, and then stayed only as long as it took to construct yet another mansion at the northwest corner of Bourne and Broadway. The Stacys were following the fashionable flight up First Hill. Their oversized mansion there is one of the few to survive. Since 1903, the home of the University Men's Club. Behind the Stacy Mansion, the first clay courts of the Seattle Tennis Club were developed in the early 1890s. It is now the site of a McDonald's parking lot. Coppin's Water Tower at 9th and Columbia provided much of the water service for the mansions on the hill and was also the best prospect from which to look down at them. And now this neighborhood of mansions is crowded with institutions, and First Hill has become something of a pill hill. But in this early 1890s scene, the big houses with big lawns dominate. Ellen Stacy's mansion was just across Madison from her friend Emily Carkeek's home. The English-born Emily, here third from the right, was the leader of Seattle society and the founder of the Seattle Historical Society. Here on Founders Day, November 13th, 1914, its charter members pose in traditional costumes on and beside the Carkeek's front porch. The first oversized house on First Hill was actually built by Colonel O'Haller, whose sturdy physiognomy somewhat resembles the wide-faced mansion he called Castle Mount. Lower Queen Anne was also first developed in the 1880s. Construction on the Kinnear Mansion began in 1885 and was rushed along by 24 carpenters. The landmark was replaced in 1955 by Bayview Manor. In 1885, the Fry Opera House was opened on First Avenue at Marion Street. At the time, it was the grandest stage north of San Francisco. It was also a meeting hall for some of the factions involved in the anti-Chinese disturbances, which climaxed on February 7, 1886, when the steamer Queen of Pacific was filled to capacity with Chinese residents forced to the waterfront by an organized mob of white laborers. Those left on the dock were surrounded by George Kinnear's Home Guard, which proceeded to escort them back to their homes until they were met again at the corner of First and Main. Fighting broke out, with the Guard firing, wounding 5, 1 fatally, of the protesters, who resented the cheap and ready labor offered by the Chinese. Martial law held for 2 weeks after the skirmish at First and Main, a corner more often used for parades like this on Independence Day, 1887. 1887 was also the year that work began on Seattle's second railroad, the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern. Its steam engine, the Thomas Burke, was named for this small-statured local dynamo who combined Eastern capital with the community's enduring resentment against the neglectful Northern Pacific to build a railroad eventually to the Canadian border from Seattle's waterfront, where its timber trestle would develop eventually into Railroad Avenue, a wide and often hazardous field of 8 paralleling tracks. But in the beginning, in 1887, Burke's new railroad ran north from its depot near Columbia Street on a single track, in a line which is now below the Alaska Way Viaduct. At the north end of Lake Union, the railroad crossed a trestle offshore of the present Stone Way, and thereafter followed the grade of what is now the Burke-Gilman Trail, including this curve at Ravenna, where 2 years later the Presbyterian minister William Beck and his wife developed Ravenna Park. The east entrance to the park is on the far left. With its last incarnation as an urban trail, the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern's grade curves through the deciduous landscape of the Ravenna neighborhood, crossing 25th Avenue at Northeast Blakely Street. The Yesler Way Cable Railway opened in 1888. Using a technique developed in San Francisco, it was the first cable railway on the coast after San Francisco. It took 16 minutes for its cars to run the 3+ miles to the attractions of Leschi Park, the dance pavilion, boathouse, hotel, lakefront promenade, and steamer connections to an east side then still largely undeveloped, with a few exceptions like the Village Kirkland and C.C. Calkin's impressive resort on Mercer Island. At Leschi, the cable cars turned a short way south to a trestle, where the cars climbed the ridge and returned by way of Jackson Street as far as Occidental Avenue, where the cable turned for the last short leg back to Yesler Way. Yesler Way, however, was soon converted to a double-track system after the dangerously wind-blown Jackson Trestle was abandoned. The timber trestle spanned what is now the Jackson Street entrance to Frink Park. On Christmas Eve, 1888, the double-ended ferry City of Seattle made its first crossing to West Seattle. 6 wagons was its capacity. The West Seattle Land and Improvement Company constructed a comely ferry dock along Harbor Avenue and soon added cable car service for West Seattle's residents and prospective buyers, carrying them up in a circle, around, and then down from the bluffs above Duwamish Head, where the company's large view lots were for sale. Below, to both sides of the ferry terminal, Harbor Avenue developed a mixed culture of industry and recreation, including an early home and harbor for the Seattle Yacht Club. The flour mill was also opened. It was linked to Seattle's waterfront with a railroad trestle a person could hike if they missed the last ferry. Here, years later, the trestle is in ruins. Beyond it is another trestle, that along Spokane Street, across which in 1907 the electric trolley was completed, linking Seattle and West Seattle above the tide flats and the Duwamish River, with cars hanging reader boards advertising what was then the city's newest recreational attraction, Luna Park, a playland supported on pilings off of Duwamish Head. Luna Park offered sensational and reasonably cheap thrills, including a roller coaster, merry-go-round, natatorium, and, quote, the longest bar in the West. This liquored carnival, then, was eventually shut down as corrosive to the morals of the city's youth. Only the natatorium was left open. And now a small part of the Luna Park site is covered by a modest observation park projected on landfill, not pilings, a short ways off Duwamish Head. Beyond Luna Park, the 2 miles of Elkai Beach served as Seattle's summer retreat. The West Seattle Bathing Pavilion was added in 1911. There its modest successor survives beside the groomed beach where the Denny party stepped ashore in 1851. Columbia City was another Seattle suburb, first developed in 1889 after the Rainier Valley Electric Trolley was laid through that community and on to Rainier Beach and remote stops beyond, like Renton. Also in 1889, the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern reached Snoqualmie Falls, an event that instantly opened the falls to day excursions. The list of events for 1889 is dominated by the Great Fire of June 6th. Photographic records of the fire itself, like this one of its start from Denny Hill and this of its advance to the waterfront depot of the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad, are very rare. The city's photographers, who were too busy saving their studios, did return, however, to record the ruins, and of which prints were sold while their subjects still smoldered. To study the fire's effects, we will first trace the lives of First Avenue north from Pioneer Square, beginning here in 1880 with its frontier setting, which in the mid-80s was elegantly transformed, on its west side at least, by a show strip of ornate business blocks made of brick and cast iron, with the Yesler-Leary building its cornerstone. And this is what survived of that show strip after the '89 fire. Or to repeat this transformation, here the ornate storefronts on the west side at first, before the fire, and here just after, a look up first over their ruins. Within 2 weeks, 138 buildings were under construction in the burned district, most of them brick. This view looks north on First from Yesler Way in 1890, when construction on the far right was proceeding on the foundation and first floor of the Pioneer Building. And here's Henry Yesler's showpiece later that year, nearly ready to receive its first tenants. By 1910, the neighborhood, made instantly new by the fire of '89, was developing into a district diversely tied to the waterfront with shipping agents, outfitters, and a slew of small hotels for traveling men. It was a neighborhood perhaps predisposed to the down and out, a condition into which it steadily advanced until its recent gentrification. This is probably the earliest photograph of the fire. It looks kitty-corner across First and Madison to the engulfed Pontius building where the fire started less than an hour earlier, when a pot of boiling glue was upset in a carpentry shop. The balcony here in the foreground is included in the bottom center of this view, which sights north up first from the upper floor of the Frye Opera House in 1886. One block north on Spring, on this balcony, the best photographs of the fire were recorded when it was still believed by some that it might be snuffed. Here, white smoke from across First is flooding the front of the Frye Opera House, and here, minutes later, black smoke is pouring from the central tower of the theater itself. A third view was photographed from the street. More recently, the typical taverns, tattoo and pawn shops, and seedier venues like the Rivoli Theater have given way to a gentrification which preserves the buildings but not the culture that once made First Avenue Flesh Avenue. A time telescope of First Avenue South, to and through the fire of 1889, begins with this late 1860s view north from near Jackson Street, continues on to this 1880 scene with the New England Hotel on the left, and panning right a bit, the Squire Opera House across the street. This year, President Chester Arthur shook 2,000 hands on the Squire House's stage. These 3 blocks between Jackson in the foreground and Yesler Way were the city's primary commercial district through all its pioneer days. The same 3 blocks are recorded here, looking south over Yesler Way from an upper floor of the Yesler Leary building. This was reduced to this by the fire, leaving the recently laid tracks of the Front Street cable warped and twisted. Seattle's first bank, the Dexter Horton at First and Washington, was one of the few structures whose sturdy shell survived the inferno somewhat. Prudently, safes from the businesses on First Avenue South were pulled from the ruins and guarded en masse in the middle of the avenue. Tents sprang up quicker than hothouse mushrooms over the burned-out district, and a totally new neighborhood did not take much longer to materialize. Since the early 1970s, First Avenue South has been part of the protected area designated by the city's Office of Preservation as the Pioneer Square Historic District. Most of the city's hotels the work which soon after restored it into the 400 Yesler building. Up on Profanity Hill, the county's landmark courthouse was razed in 1931 with 200 sticks of dynamite, revealing behind it the new Harborview Hospital. By then, the county's offices and courts had long since moved off the hill to the site of the old Yesler Mansion, where in 1914 the city-county building's first 6 floors were constructed in the shadow of the brand-new Smith Tower and beside City Hall Park. The most successful cable system in the history of the city ran the length of Madison Street. The block between 2nd and 3rd Avenue was measured as the 3rd steepest in the cable industry before its grade was eased with the 1907 Madison Avenue regrade. The Madison Street Cable Railway began service in 1890. Its powerhouse was near 23rd Avenue, and like the Eslerway cable line, which developed Leshigh Park, this cable railway's promoters built a park at its Lake Washington terminus, featuring a variety of attractions to lure riders, including a sizable theater and dance pavilion. In this early view down Madison's last stretch into Madison Park, the park's pavilion surmounts a young and still somewhat barren landscape, which a century later has filled in considerably. Madison Park was also the Seattle terminal for ferry service to Kirkland, named for the Englishman Peter Kirk, who in 1890 developed there a steel mill which failed to produce a single ingot. The electric railway to Fremont was another 1890 creation. The line rode a timber trestle along the west shore of Lake Union, now the filled-in swath of Westlake Avenue. Fremont was developed in the late 1880s as a mill town and was incorporated into the city in 1891, along with the future University District, seen here across Portage Bay, and Green Lake, which was then still largely undeveloped. The lake was connected to Fremont by a wagon road, seen here under a mantle of snow, and an electric trolley line, which was laid just above the lake's old shoreline, and here beneath the McDonald House, which today is still in use as a bed and breakfast. Here David Denny poses at the southeast corner of Lake Union aboard the front of his car number 1. Denny's electric trolley to Latona and Brooklyn, now the University District, reached its northern terminus at Ravenna Park in 1892. From the beginning, the park's principal attractions included the stream that flowed from Green Lake through the park and on to Lake Washington, the mineral springs, and the big trees, which the Beck family, the park's developers, named for big people, like the Polish pianist Paderewski, a friend of Mrs. Beck, herself a musician. Theodore Roosevelt, who once visited the park's big sticks and spoke softly of his sublime approval, was also awarded the namesake tree. Sometime later, and long before environmental impact statements were required, Ravenna Park's big trees were cleared by the park department without public comment and ultimately replaced by a mere tennis court. At Lake Union, David Denny's trolley crossed the Latona Bridge, seen here from the bell tower of the Denny Hall on the university campus. On the horizon is a clear-cut Queen Anne Hill, and just beyond the bridge, the Wallingford Peninsula, as yet uncluttered with the towers of the gasworks, imbricates with the waters of Lake Union. In 1919, the Latona Bridge was replaced by the University Bridge, less than 100 yards to the east of the old swing bridge, which crossed the lake to Latona at its narrow entrance to Portage Bay, and directly in line with the Seattle Freeway's Ship Canal Bridge, which was completed in 1962. The freeway bridge lay idle while construction continued on the freeway itself, and during Century 21, the empty high bridge was briefly and somewhat bizarrely considered as a parking lot for World's Fair visitors. Returning to the David Denny's, their claim, seen here from Queen Anne, had developed to this by 1893, the year that, however, ruined many, including David and Louisa. They lost their railroad, and here on the right, their mansion, which was eventually taken from them when the city's banks, including David's brother Arthur's bank, the Dexter Horton, demanded payment on overdue loans. But the crash year, 1893, was also the year the Great Northern arrived. At last, Seattle became the terminus for a transcontinental railroad, although by then the city's old adversary, the Northern Pacific, was giving it equal service with Tacoma. The new railroad arrived without much fanfare. The Madison Street trolley was decorated for the occasion, and an industrial exhibit was briefly opened on Pioneer Square. 11 years later, in 1904, the world's then largest steamers, the Great Northern's Dakota and Minnesota, arrived at the railroad's Smith Cove docks, and thereby linked the GN's transcontinental rails with its trans-Pacific steam, to speed the perishable but lucrative silk through Seattle to the East Coast mills. Smith Cove was named for Henry Smith, perhaps the noblest of Seattle's early settlers. The poet, botanist, linguist, and surgeon settled at Inner Bay in 1853 and died there in 1915 at the age of 85. Here in the late 1880s, we see beyond the Smith home the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Trestle at Smith Cove entering Inner Bay. At the time of Smith's death, the newly formed Port of Seattle was filling in the tide flats of his cove and building Piers 90 and 91, the longest earth-filled piers in the world. The 1893 economic crash was made harder off Skid Road in 1894 by a local ordinance revoking the license of any establishment that both employed women and sold liquor. Box House bordello theaters like the Lyric at Occidental in Maine were ruined, temporarily. Denny Hall was dedicated in 1895, the first structure on the university's new North Campus, and despite some Philistines' attempts to raze it during that architecturally dismal decade, the 1950s, the French chateau-style Denny Hall survives, although the bell, which was originally moved from the old campus to its belfry, has been chained and replaced with electronic chimes. The 1890s was the decade of the bicycle, and beginning in 1896, the Queen City Good Roads Club helped the city's engineers build a system of bike trails around Lake Union and on to Lake Washington. Chief Seattle's daughter, whom Catherine Maynard named Princess Angeline, died in 1896. For years, she lived in a waterfront shack near where now the Pike Street hill climb descends from the public market to the aquarium. Angeline was given a sentimental burial at Lakeview Cemetery. Placed in a canoe-shaped casket with a paddle resting on the stern, she was buried beneath a rough-hewn monument, and nearby her patron Henry Yesler Stone. Yesler had died 4 years earlier. The systematic reclamation of the tide flats south of Pioneer Square began in 1896, and the following year Moritz Thompson built his Centennial Mill on the newly made land near the waterfront foot of what is now Royal Brome Way. Also in 1897, Donald Frederick and Nels Nelson moved their then 8-year-old furniture store into the Rialto building, where there was room enough to develop one of Seattle's first department stores. However, the portentous event of 1897 was the arrival of the steamer Portland from Alaska with what the local dailies headlined its ton of gold. The stampede to the north began instantly, with Seattle firms managing most of the outfitting and transportation to the Klondike goldfields. Seattle's waterfront, still a rough assemblage of timber quays beneath which the tide splashed, was a strip of sustained excitement as ships, crowded with novice miners and their supplies, left for the north to later return, hopefully, but very rarely, rich. The rush north was given added life in 1898 when gold was discovered on the shores of Nome, Alaska. Here at the foot of Spring Street on June 3, 1901, the steamer Humboldt takes on its 800 tons of cargo and 320 passengers, including 35 members of a theater company booked for Nome's biggest theater, the Standard. The Humboldt, like the passengers aboard the SS Ohio, would too often have to sit days in the ice of the Bering Sea, waiting for it to loosen and let them through to Nome. The Pioneer Square totem was a prize stolen from the gold rush when a group of local businessmen, curiously named the Goodwill Committee, was sent north by the Chamber of Commerce to promote Seattle's courtship with the North. They returned to Seattle with the totem. They stopped to cut down without asking and hauled away from Tongass Island. They were later fined. At the totem's October 19, 1899 dedication, the wrought iron arches erected for yet another celebration was still a work in progress on Pioneer Square. The iron arches are seen completed here and decorated for the November 6th welcome home of the Washington Volunteers who served in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. Shipped back aboard the SS Queen, the volunteers were followed into Elliott Bay by an entourage of 18 steamers. Soon thereafter, City Park atop Capitol Hill was renamed for the volunteers, A rock at the park's southern entrance commemorates that change. Also in 1899, the first duplex along Fort Lawton's Officers' Row was completed. Ye Old Curiosity Shop was opened on the waterfront. The steamer Idaho was propped on piles at the foot of Jackson Street and converted into the Wayside Mission, a hospital for the down and out. Arthur Denny died at the age of 77 in 1899, and Hing Wo opened his laundry on Fifth Avenue, now the site of the King County Administration Building. At the time, Hing Wo's was one of 25 Chinese hand laundries in a community of nearly 90,000. In 1900, the first automobile came to town. Not this one, but one like it. It too was electric. The steamer City of Seattle returned from the north, carrying nearly 3 tons of gold. $22 million worth of dust and bullion passed through the Seattle Assay Office in 1900. Also in 1900, the city purchased Woodland Park on Finney Ridge from the Finney family, whose private trolley ran up Fremont Avenue to the park's granite gate off 50th Avenue. Posted park rules included warnings against spitting, swearing, gambling, threats that stray dogs would be shot, and a request that the last one to leave turn off the water. The 1901 decision to build the new federal building at 3rd and Union was a victory for the Uptown Boys, who promoted the move of the city's commercial center to the north. Meet Me at the Steps was for many years a familiar proposal, referring to the post office's wide stairway on 3rd. Also in 1901, ex-Washington Governor Eugene Semple began his quixotic but failed attempt to cut a canal through Beacon Hill to Lake Washington. Semple did manage to remove by trestle some of Beacon Hill, sluicing and then spreading it over a few acres of tide lands, which in 1901 were still regularly flooded with the waters of Elliott Bay. This view looks west from Beacon Hill along the line of the Spokane Street Viaduct, with a glimpse only of the Spokane Street corridor, now for comparison. In 1918, Sears was still bordered by this wetland. Some other parts of the city's industrial district, south of Pioneer Square, were not filled until the 1930s. Turn-of-the-century changes on the central waterfront involved a realignment of its piers from this stubby and jumbled collection to the uniform alignment of the new, in 1901, Northern Pacific Piers 3, 4, and 5. That's now Piers 54 through 56. After Coleman Dock, the Northern Pacific's Pier 3 was the principal Seattle port for the Mosquito fleet of small-sized steamers that, before the development of the culture of motor cars, were the best and often only sensible way of traveling between the mostly east side communities on Puget Sound, or up its tributaries like the Duwamish and Snohomish rivers. Piers 55 and 56, here center and far right, were home to larger ocean-going steamers with ports of call from London to Vladivostok. Now the central waterfront has long since turned from work to play, and the noise and confusion across Railroad Avenue's 8 sets of parallel tracks has been reduced to the music of the waterfront trolley's cars riding their double tracks, sometimes in antiphony, with the occasional busker and, in this instance, a band of non-ninja and yet definitely hip reptiles. On February 21st, 1901, water from Cedar River was first piped into the city's mains. Tested for its purity and bouquet by members of the city council, the new system allowed the city to discontinue drawing its water from the increasingly polluted Lake Washington. The abandoned pump house at Coleman Park was eventually converted into a dressing house for park swimmers. The capacity of the high reservoir at Volunteer Park was supplemented in 1907 with the completion of the park's standpipe, from whose observation deck the prospect north looked out on the park's conservatory and its Olmsted Brothers landscaping, which in the intervening 80-plus years has filled in considerably, standing now nearly as high as the tower. In 1932, the Art Deco Seattle Art Museum was added to the park's attractions. Returning now to 1901, this year Seattle Times publisher Alden Blethen moved his family into their classical colonial home on Queen Anne Hill's West Highland Drive, view property which was reached on the Queen Anne Avenue counterbalance seen here from Mercer Street in 1902. Beneath the street were, and still are, although now idle, two tunnels along which weighted or counterbalanced cars connected to streetcars above help pull them up Queen Anne Avenue and restrain them in their descent of the avenue's steep grade. Trackless trolleys replaced the counterbalance in 1940 as part of the city's system-wide conversion from rails to rubber. In 1902, the view south from West Highland Drive looked over the future site of Seattle Center to a business district then still hidden behind the gentle rise of Denny Hill and its distinguished landmark, the Denny Hotel. Since the construction of the Space Needle for Century 21 in 1962, the view from Queen Anne has been considerably filled out with the modern clutter of a skyline which, with a few exceptions, like Mount Rainier when you can see it, is more conventional than distinguished. Returning to 1902, Broadway High School on Capitol Hill opened this year, the first city school devoted exclusively to grades 9 through 12. The Seattle-Tacoma Interurban began operating this year with a 75-minute express trip between Tacoma and its Seattle depot here on Occidental Avenue just off of Yesler Way. Previously, Mosquito Fleet steamers like the Flyer had a monopoly on the movement of passengers between the ports of Tacoma, here on Commencement Bay in Seattle. In 1902, the university added Science Hall, now Parrington, to Denny Hall, and at last eliminated preparatory courses, devoting itself exclusively to higher education. Here, Parrington Hall, partially hidden behind the fir on the left, has taken its place beside Denny Hall. The Elks Carnival of 1902 was the first of the city's big summertime celebrations and featured 3 parade arches, the highest of which was the classical span built across First Avenue at Columbia Street. The week-long Golden Potlatch Days, which began in 1911, were citywide events sponsored for themselves rather than distinguished visitors or by fraternal conventions. With the Potlatch parades were a daily occasion, including a Parade of All Nations featuring an Afro-American float among many others. The 1913 Potlatch introduced Father's Day to Seattle with a parade of pops dressed in aprons and ball and chain and carrying domestic utensils. The last of the city's monumental street arches spanned 2nd at Marion during the Knights Templar's 1925 Seattle Convention. By then, 2nd Avenue was the city's preferred parade route. Returning to 1903, the streetcar strike of May 27th was a sign of organized labor's growing power in a city which would later earn a reputation as one of the nation's strongest union towns. The Seattle Symphony was established in 1903 under the direction of Harry West. On May 23rd, Theodore Roosevelt made his first visit to Seattle. Leading an entourage of Mosquito Fleet steamers, the great Rough Rider walked off the steamer Spokane at the foot of University Street and paraded through a city packed for the occasion. That evening he was the first guest at the Washington Hotel, the old Denny Hotel, atop Denny Hill. The hotel's lobby was easily the city's most elegant space. A 1-block-long counterbalanced railway climbed from the corner of 3rd and Pine to the hotel's front door. Only 4 years later, the Grand Hotel was destroyed, a sacrifice to city engineer Reginald Thompson's promise to dig the city out of its hole. The Denny regrade was the single biggest public work in Seattle's history. It eventually scraped and hosed away the clay and gravel of Denny Hill from 40-plus city blocks. In the last years of the horse, it was claimed that the hill, seen here from Elliott Bay, inhibited the, quote, natural northerly expansion of the city, unquote. Actually, the regraders and North End boomers had the techniques and tools to flatten the pitch of this modest hill into pricey real estate, and it was completed, ironically, in time for the automobile and acres of parking lots. Actually, Denny Hill was a natural resource, adding variety to the city's shape, seen here from First Hill, and a marvelous prospect from which to inspect the bay and city in all directions. This group, posed for their profiles perhaps, looks west towards the bay from the hotel's front balcony. Looking between them, to their left, we can just glimpse the line of 3rd Avenue, rendered here in 1890 before the hotel was constructed on the site by an artist who had the freedom to insert the often shrouded Mount Rainier. And here again in 1903, atop the Washington Hotel's front balcony, when the late afternoon sun throws long shadows across the 3rd Avenue, which was then something of a church row. The same prospect today looks out from the roof of a parking lot. It is perspective still about 40 or 50 feet lower than that from the hotel. Church Row has long since lost its sanctuaries to the temples of commerce. The imposing presence of the Gothic hotel was best felt from the floor of 3rd Avenue. This view, photographed from near Seneca Street, includes the spire of Plymouth Congregational Church on the far right. Here in 1907, the regrade is approaching the hotel's central tower, while below 3rd Avenue is being wrestled to a grade more convenient, perhaps, for commerce. All this was torn up once more in the late 1980s for the construction of the bus tunnel, which now runs beneath 3rd Avenue from Jackson Street to Pine. The Denny Hill regrade began on 1st Avenue in the mid-1880s to ease the grade for the horse cars approaching Belltown. This cliff along the avenue's eastern side, north of Virginia Street, was a fixture until the regraders began their move east to 2nd Avenue, seen here looking south from Bell Street, before the regrade and hereafter. By 1906, a cliff had been created along the east side of 2nd, south of Virginia. The Moore Theater and the New Washington Hotel were completed by 1908, when the regraders began their attack on the main portion of the hill east of 2nd. There, the excavating created some Wagnerian landscapes and large mannered movement of houses. For instance, this tilting structure, photographed here in early 1910, was soon after dragged west to a position hidden behind the spike or mound on the right. Its new place in front of that mound is revealed in this scene, photographed in October of 1910. And here we also see Denny School at 5th and Battery, with its west wing cutaway, sacrificed to a new cliff along 5th Avenue. This view looks north from the top of that precipice, and upper right shows Denny School minus its west wing. A left turn, 18 years later, looks west from the top of the cliff on 5th and reveals how the original regraded blocks had developed by 1928, or had not developed. The big home that was moved in 1910 still survives in the shadows of the new neighborhood. Aside from the Denny Hotel, the most photographed structure in the history of the regrade was this rooming house at 4th and Lenora. Lowered by jacks and cribbing step by step, it was then remodeled for the new neighborhood without its gabled roof. Behind it we can again see the cliff along 5th, where in 1911 the regrade stopped for 18 years. At its base, the cliff was quite imposing, in this setting north from near Lenora Street in late 1910. Looking in the opposite direction, south, or from nearly the same place only 25 years earlier, shows the wagon road that ran north from the city along the line of 5th Avenue, which was then still about 20 feet higher than the elevated track which supports today's monorail as it approaches Lenora Street on its run between the Westlake Mall and Seattle Center. The grand neoclassical civic center that was included in Virgil Bogue's 1911 plan for Seattle and proposed for the freshly regraded area was rejected by voters in 1912. Instead, the regrade neighborhood, seen here from the Space Needle in the early 60s, developed into an often depressed and ordinarily undistinguished district of warehouses, apartments, and service industries. Returning now to 1904, the launching of the keel of the battleship Nebraska from Moran's shipyard that year and the subsequent construction of its superstructure was prophetic of the role played by Seattle shipyards during the two world wars. The launch of the Nebraska was the stern Robert Moran's second big splash. The first was his fleet of 12 light draft riverboats built on the tide flats in 1898 for use on the Yukon River. In this view from Beacon Hill, the fleet appears under construction on the tidelands, near where Moritz Thompson built his Centennial Mill 2 years earlier. The boats straddled the present route of Royal Brome Way. Their paddle wheels sat on what is now the Kingdome South parking lot. In 1898, high tides could still reach the shores of Beacon Hill, but by 1914 this part of the tidelands south of Pioneer Square was filled in, and the waterfront was secured where the Skinner and Eddy shipyard, formerly Moran's, waited for the record ship orders that were soon delivered with the First World War. When the layoffs and pay reductions which followed that war inspired a strike at the shipyards, it quickly developed 2 weeks later into the city's 5-day general strike in February 1919. Here at 7th and Union, strikers gather outside the Dreamland Dance Hall, a large pavilion frequently used for labor rallies and lectures. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, many of the remaining open spaces south of Pioneer Square were made domestic by homeless men. The old Skinner and Eddy acres off East Marginal Way were developed into a Hooverville, named for the president under whose watch the Depression began. This community of homeless men survived until torched by the powers that be in the late 30s. When still intact, nearly 1,000 men lived in Hooverville in the shadow of the Smith Tower. It is now the site of the Port of Seattle's container field off East Marginal Way. Rudimentary squatting on Seattle's beaches began in 1865 when the town's first ordinances included a prohibition against Indians camping in town. Later, the natives' use of Ballast Island and the new man-made beaches south of King Street during the Tidelands reclamation continued this tradition. Muckamuck, the spring-fed beach below Denny Hill, was also a popular native camping ground. Note the Seattle Lakeshore and Eastern Trestle on the left. After the 1893 National Depression, this beach was developed into an elaborate neighborhood of squatters' shacks. This view dates from 1903 or 4. The Alaska Building, Seattle's first steel-girdered skyscraper, was built in 1904 at Cherry and 2nd. It continued the shift of the city's center from the old Pioneer Square to 2nd Avenue, which developed into the city's commercial canyon of glass, terracotta, brick, and granite. Its urbane, grand style was so admired that it was fittingly exaggerated in that perennial vehicle of civic promotion, the postcard. Also in 1904, Alexander Pantages opened his vaudeville house, the Pantages Theater, at 2nd and Seneca. In 1905, the city's new dynamos on the Cedar River began sending the first of Seattle's municipally owned power to the city's first substation on Yesler Way. City Light used its kilowatts to generously promote people power, especially at its Lake Union steam plant, which it added in 1917. Relief came to Railroad Avenue on the city's congested central waterfront in 1905 when trains were diverted through the railroad tunnel beneath the city, which was completed that year, and complemented the following year by the King Street Depot. Much of the new railroad yard created south of King Street on the reclaimed tide flats was eventually chosen as the site for construction of the county's dome stadium, the Kingdome, which, since its opening in 1976, has given sports fans air-conditioned cover in all seasons, hot, cold, winning, and losing, mostly losing. Westlake Avenue was cut through between Pike Street and Lake Union in 1906, creating a new throughway to the north and a promising five-star corner at 4th and Pike. Early proposals for originating a county-wide elevated transit at Westlake Mall were modestly realized when the downtown terminal for Century 21's monorail was sited there in 1962. Colonel Hiram Chittenden's 1906 arrival in Seattle would ultimately lead to the creation and survival of the Port of Seattle and the construction of the Lake Washington Ship Canal. The canal lowered Lake Washington 9 feet in 1916, but not yet here. This is a rare look in 1905 from the university campus across Union Bay to the peninsula which 1 year later in 1906 would be promoted as Laurelhurst, the, quote, most aristocratic section of the city. The peninsula, or part of it, had already been used since 1901 as the first home for the Seattle Golf and Country Club. Across Union Bay from the Laurelhurst promotion, also in 1906, The university's associated students opened their boathouse in response to the then wildly popular canoe and mandolin courting craze. When the lake was lowered, the exposed west shore of Union Bay was used as a city dump, over which the university developed its athletic facilities, including, at the site of the old boathouse, this front lawn to the students' intramural building, wherein the wildly popular contemporary courting craze of bodybuilding is in full flex. What is for many Seattle's greatest institution, the Pike Place Public Market, was created in 1907 as a means of bringing the farmer and the buyer together for a fresh and frugal transaction. Saved from the threat of urban renewal in the late 1960s, the market survives as the city's best living laboratory for a community built on diversity and fresh produce. In 1907, the Jackson Street regrade was started up, and it soon ran a close second to the Denny regrade. Nearly 90 feet of elevation was sluiced from this previously steep Jackson grade east of Fifth Avenue to this gentle incline. One of the few structures saved, the Japanese Baptist Church at the northwest corner of Jackson and Maynard, was lowered by L.B. Gullett, who advertised himself as tried and true in such moving experiences. Now the building's familiar twin gables are supported above floors which were added where once there was hill. In 1909, the regrading of the International District moved a few blocks south to Dearborn Street, where a cut 108 feet deep opened Rainier Valley to the Central Business District. The university's downtown campus on Denny Knoll survived for 12 years after the school moved to its new campus, until 1907, when it was cut through with the 4th Avenue regrade, seen here looking west from University Street. The regrade of the knoll prepared the site for development of the Metropolitan Tract, the city within a city, as its promoters put it. In 1910, the women of the YWCA, whose temporary quarters at 4th and Seneca were about 30 feet below the pre-regrade site of the old university building, used 4th Avenue as a staging ground for an auto parade promoting their successful fundraising campaign to build their permanent home nearby at 5th and Seneca. In 1924, the Olympic Hotel was built on the old university site. The tract also included the White Henry Stewart building, which has been replaced by the Rainier Tower, and the Professional Cobb building on the left with its terracotta adornments, which survive as the last of the Metropolitan Tract's first brick business blocks. When attempts to have the old Territorial University building moved to the new campus failed, the structure was moved a short ways from the regrading juggernaut on 4th and eventually stripped of its columns, which were then moved to the new campus, where they still stand in the green shade of the university's Sylvan Theater. Other developments in 1907 included the opening of the Dream Theater on First, one of the city's first movie houses. Also, West Seattle, Georgetown, and here Ballard, all of them incorporated communities, gave up their independence in 1907 to become part of Seattle. Since 1976, Ballard Avenue has been one of the city's designated historic districts, and here the ghosts of Ballard Pass can be felt especially on quiet Sunday mornings. St. James Cathedral was dedicated in 1907 with one human flaw which announced itself with a crash during the big snow of 1916 when the church's cupola fell to the chancel below, leaving a sanctuary with a decidedly reduced profile. And staying with the snow for a moment, the Queen Anne counterbalance and the rest of the city's transportation was stuck in the blizzard. Green Lake froze over in the week before the February snow, which after the big snow of 1880 is still the deepest into the city's now nearly century-and-a-half history. The now long familiar gasworks opened at the north end of Lake Union in 1907 and continued to manufacture gas there until 1956. 19 years later, in 1975, this industrial temple was saved with the creation of Gasworks Park, a surreal juxtaposition of the grotesque and the picturesque. In 1908, Seattle joined the national playground movement and quickly became a leader in the development of supervised play in the city's parks, first here at Collins Playfield. In 1976, the Seattle Buddhist Temple converted the playfield across Main Street from the temple into Wisteria Park. Also in 1908, part of Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet visited Elliott Bay. For the parade welcoming the fleet, 2nd Avenue was decked out in patriotic bunting, including this arabesque of flags, blazoned across the front of Frederick and Nelson's, then still at 2nd and Madison. The city, however, has never been so done up as for the 1909 Alaska, Yukon, and Pacific Exposition, AYP for short, Seattle's first World's Fair built to celebrate the city's success in Alaska and its hopes for continuing that influence along the Pacific Rim. The AYP's Arctic Circle was the fair's elegant face with its domed federal building, looking down the fair's cascades and over its fountain to a Mount Rainier, which in this official rendering has been brought forward to the shores of Lake Washington by a postcard artist. At night, the AYP's White City was illuminated, and generally the Arctic Circle was a sublime environment in which to stroll or relax on the benches that surrounded the fountain, which was later renamed the Drumheller Fountain, now the only part of the fair's Arctic Circle that survives on the UW campus. The AYP's other face was painted and gaudy, its Carnival Avenue or Pay Streak with thrilling rides, exotic restaurants, sensational theaters, and even Aborigines. The Igorots from the Philippines, whose potentially scandalous loincloths were judged anthropologically proper by an especially arranged ethics committee, which included such upright citizens as Judge Thomas Burke on the right, and the lanky progressive Reverend Mark Matthews, whose firebrand sermons filled the pews at First Presbyterian Church. The pay streak extended from Old Meany Hall to Portage Bay, with the railroad bed which is now the Burke-Gilman Trail crossing it about midway. The streak's southern half is now crowded with the university's South Campus across Pacific Avenue. Lake Washington Boulevard was completed in 1909 in time for the tourism connected with the AYP. This view of its bridge at Frink Park has received a variety of postcard colorings, and even a retouch that eliminates the motor car's intrusion on this picturesque setting. The most picturesque part of the Lake Washington Boulevard was the Mount Baker curve, including the boathouse and Mount Rainier, which here typically has been retouched in. The ragged line of incision is faintly evident, running conveniently along the mountain's snow line. The Seattle-Everett Interurban was completed to Everett in 1910 and kept making its circuit to and from its Seattle depot on Stewart Street, the present Greyhound Depot, until 1939, when the competition from automobiles and buses shut it down. An itinerant barn burner named Charles Hamilton made the first local heavier-than-air flight in 1910. The exhibition was staged at the Meadows, the local racetrack beside the Duwamish River. Down a runway of planks laid atop the cushion of mud, Hamilton made it aloft and passed above the Meadows Lake before crashing into it, bruised but not seriously injured. 21 years earlier, in 1889, another itinerant flyer, Professor T. Van Tassel, made the first local lighter-than-air flight, riding his balloon aloft from the gas plant on Jackson Street and parachuting back to Earth over Smith Cove. In 1960, William E. Boeing, who by some reports was present at the Meadows the day Hamilton went up and then quickly down again, built the B&W at his factory beside Lake Union. The company soon moved into its Little Red Barn, actually a converted boathouse, on the Duwamish River to manufacture military planes during the First World War. In 1919, Bill Boeing, here on the right, and his co-pilot Eddie Hubbard flew through the snow to Vancouver, British Columbia and back on the first international airmail flight to take off from the United States. The list of famous flights originating in Seattle must include the Navy flyers who began and concluded their 1924 round-the-world flight at Sandpoint. Boeing's contribution to domestic flight was advanced with the first delivery of its Model 80 to Boeing Air Transport in August 1928, only 2 weeks after its first flight. Also in 1928, King County dedicated the airfield it had created out of these farm fields south of Georgetown. Making its commitment to domestic flight, the county named it for their neighbor, Bill Boeing. Boeing Field's administration building was dedicated 2 years later in 1930. The Boeing Clipper was tested in 1938 on Lake Washington and based at Matthews Beach just north of Sandpoint. World War II soon halted the model's manufacture, so only 12 Clippers were completed. During the war, Boeing Plant 2 at South Park was covered with a decoy neighborhood, including squatty autos and homes. Below the camouflage, at the peak of production, 16 B-17s, or Flying Fortresses, were produced every 24 hours. After World War II, SeaTac Airport was built by the Port of Seattle to prepare for the passenger jet age, which was propelled forward in 1954 with the first test flight of the Boeing 707. Returning now to 1911, this year King County voters created the Port of Seattle, and in a related public work, construction began on the Lake Washington Ship Canal and its Chittenden locks on Salmon Bay. In another act of radical hydraulics, Green Lake was lowered 7 feet in 1911, thereby beaching this boathouse on the lake's southwest shore, exposing the timber piles that supported West Green Lake Way, and most relevantly exposing new parkland. Now the lake's new girdle of grass and paths separates a graded West Green Lake Way from the lake shore. Green Lake was first developed in the early 1890s. This view looks west across the lake to a Finney Ridge horizon. The 1893 Depression dulled this development until the late 90s, when the city's booming population inevitably pushed north to the lake, especially the east side of it. One part of a 1903 panorama, this scene continues south here. This prospect towards Finney Ridge is now intersected by the Interstate 5 freeway. Coleman Dock, especially after this handsome version of it was constructed in time for the city's 1909 Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, was the principal port for Puget Sound's Mosquito fleet of small steamers. On April 25, 1912, as the ocean-going steel-hulled Alameda approached the dock, the ship's captain, Dynamite John O'Brien, commanded the ship's engineer to give a routine full speed astern and was answered instead with a full speed ahead with these results. Miraculously, no one was hurt, but the dock's clock tower was knocked into the bay. The repaired dock's new tower is seen here in 1913 as the application of the Smith Tower's terracotta skin reaches for its pyramidal cap. Months earlier, the Grand Trunk Pier, one wharf north of the Coleman Dock, was photographed from the bay with the Smith Tower steel skeleton behind it. The Smith Tower was dedicated on July 4, 1914. Days later, on July 30th, the Grand Trunk Dock was fuel for the city's biggest fire since the Great One of 1889. The city's 2 fireboats, the Snoqualmie and here the Duwamish, were berthed at Fire Station Number 5 in the slip just north of the Grand Trunk Pier, but neither the fireboats nor the fire station's own barrage of showers could save the pier, which when it was rebuilt was finished sans tower. Seattle's newest fireboat, the Chief Seattle, is stationed at the same slip, but the rebuilt Grand Trunk Dock has long since been replaced with a parking lot for the Washington State Ferries Terminal, the present incarnation of Coleman Dock. the last Coleman dock with a tower was sacrificed in the mid-1930s, his tower was this time intentionally dropped in the bay and towed away. The new Art Deco terminal built in its place was designed to complement the Blackball Ferry's new streamlined Kalakala, seen here returning from Bremerton, and here on an excursion through the Chittenden Locks in the late 1940s, which returns us to the Big Snow of 1916 and the first flooding of the canal's Big Lock. That summer, the waters of Lake Washington were lowered 9 feet to the level of Lake Union, and on August 3rd, the Army Corps' launch Orcus and its snag boat, the Swinomish, were the first boats to be lifted through the Big Lock into the new inland freshwater harbor. It was the lock's informal opening. The official opening came nearly 1 year later on July 4th, 1917, when the Roosevelt, Captain Byrd's Arctic explorer, led a flotilla through the Chittenden Locks and down the length of the new canal into Lake Washington. Now, after the Seattle Center, Chittenden Locks are the city's most frequented attraction. The new canal required the construction of bascule bridges at Ballard and Fremont. The flooding of the canal, of course, inundated the dam, which was first built at Lake Union's outlet in 1888, with the founding of the Milltown Fremont. The dam's works doubled as a popular scaffolding for spearing salmon. In 1914, the dam broke, dropping Lake Union by several feet and taking the wooden trestle Fremont Bridge, the predecessor of the bascule, with it. The canal eventually brought the University District its own bascule as well, seen here from the deck during its 1919 dedication. The bridge at Montlake was added in 1925, 5 years after the University of Washington's athletic department began a campaign for a bridge to ease access to the university's new football stadium. Its dedication day, November 27, 1920, is recorded in this panorama. On the field, Dartmouth beat the university 28-7. The Montlake Cut for ships is about 100 yards north of the original log canal and locks which linked Lake Washington and Lake Union first in 1882. Later, the log canal was widened enough to allow through the occasional canoe. Seen here from the north end of Capitol Hill, the old log canal is in line with the present link between I-5 and the Evergreen Point Bridge. The city completed its municipally owned trolley to Ballard in 1918, taking a photo opportunity here on the then-new Ballard-Bascule Bridge. The following year, the city purchased the rest of the community's decaying trolley system at a price it would still have not paid off when the rails were discarded for rubber in 1940. This is the system's north yard at 5th and Mercer during the time of that transition. The locals were ordered to wear masks when the global flu pandemic reached Seattle in the first week of October 1918. The order against public gathering was not lifted or dropped with the masks until Armistice Day, November 11th. Nellie Cornish moved her School of Arts into its new plant on Roy Street in 1921. In 1921, Elliott Avenue still extended north of Mercer Street on a timbered trestle. Turning around and looking south, the trestle turned up West Mercer Place parallel to the trolley tracks. Directly south was Sand Alone, bordered by a string of squatters' shacks. Within 2 years, Elliott Avenue was graded, paved, and connected to the central waterfront. In 1924, Roland Denny, a 2-month-old baby at the 1851 Alki Landing, was flown over Seattle to inspect and no doubt reflect on a city which, like himself, was only 73 years old. In 1925, the University Bookstore moved out of Denny Hall on campus and onto University Avenue, the Ave for short, where it has developed into the largest retailer of general books among the nation's university bookstores. Bertha Landis was elected mayor of Seattle in 1926, the first woman mayor of any major American city. The soul of the university was constructed in 1927 and was later named for the former university president Henry Suzzalo, who was fired by the state's conservative governor Roland Hartley in part for what he described as the library's extravagance. In its original plans, the library included a central tower in the academic Gothic style. Inside this cathedral of books was designed less for books than for looking up from books. The Tudor vault, 73 feet above the reading room's floor, still invites erudite gazing the distance of the big room's 240 feet. The city's skyline was given its uptown anchor in 1928 when the Art Deco Northern Life Tower was opened at 3rd and University. Its 27 stories continued to top off the central business district's north end, later even than this 1956 view of it from First Hill. Then, after the 1968 construction of the Seafirst Tower, a rapid succession of high-rises screened the sky, all of it topped off in 1985 with the out-of-scale 76 floors of the Columbia Center Tower. The addition of the Ice Arena, Civic Field, and Civic Auditorium to the city's cultural life in 1928 continued a tradition of arts and recreation already established at the site of the future World's Fair. This part of David and Louisa Denny's claim was a natural swale where earlier natives held potlatches and strung nets to capture waterfowl flying low between Elliott Bay and the wetlands at the south end of Lake Union. Later, the swale was used as a temporary corral for army mules mobilized during the Spanish-American War. This 1899 view, which looks east over the mules and across the swale towards the Capitol Hill horizon, repeated today is packed with the stuff of Seattle Center. The swale was also a popular staging ground for visiting circuses. This view of it from Queen Anne Hill was photographed in 1896 from very near the same position as this 1930 record of the then nearly new Civic Auditorium, and this contemporary record from the same perspective. The last of the Denny regrades was completed in 1931, the year this aerial was recorded looking north over the central business district and revealing the scar between 5th Avenue and Westlake left by the regrade. Construction began on the Aurora Bridge in 1929. Before the bridge's two cantilevers met in June of 1931, the tallest ships, including the Monongahela, that were anchored in the fresh waters of Lake Union, were towed out. Others with lower masts stayed. The Lake Union fleets were not limited to sailing ships, but included lines of wooden freighters built for but never used in World War I, and the crews of University of Washington, who used the lakes for training. The Aurora Bridge was dedicated on February 22, 1932. It was the city's most imposing link in the new Pacific Coast Highway, which was also cut through Woodland Park, an act which understandably inspired a storm of protest from all sides, but which proceeded nonetheless. The new Aurora Thruway paralleled the old trolley right-of-way through Woodland Park, which since the early 1890s had been a popular sightseer's excursion. Woodland Park's Auto Camp, which was opened in 1921 for the new summer culture of sightseeing car tourists, was closed by the city in 1929, describing it as a, quote, bedroom for freeloading gas car gypsies. South of the bridge, Aurora was widened into a speedway. Here at Broad Street, Aurora is sited by 2 rows of power poles. The row on the right at the street's new and widened curb, and the row on the left, soon to be removed at the curb of the old, narrow neighborhood street. Broad Mercer streets were major obstructions to the limited access on Aurora Speedway and were both tunneled below Highway 99 in the late 1950s. Bread lines and soup kitchens and political rallies and squatters' shacks were regular features of the 1930s in Seattle as everywhere. And strikes like that by maritime workers in 1934, here obstructing the loading of the Alaska Steamship Company's liner Victoria at Pier 2. In 1931, the Unemployed Citizens League founded what it called the Republic of the Penniless. At its peak, the league involved 50,000 members in Seattle alone, and its barter economy spread throughout the state, encouraging exchanges of services and goods between town and country. And here we return, not to the present, but to where we began this chronology, with this poetic postcard, which enclosed within the letters spelling Seattle the city's principal symbols at the dawn of World War II. The postcard's two towers, the Smith and the totem, have survived, although the original stolen totem, dedicated in Pioneer Square in 1899, was disfigured by fire and replaced by this convincing copy. Chittenden Locks, Snoqualmie Falls, the lake, and beyond it the mountain all endure as community symbols. Perhaps only the Aurora Bridge, although it too survives, has slipped from this pantheon. One of these touchstones of community pride has perished, however, the Mercer Island Bridge, which sank during the Thanksgiving storm of 1990. When it was new, the bridge opened up the east side with a speed and ease the old Lake Washington ferries like the Leschi could not hope to match. Construction of the floating bridge began in 1939, the year that Roland Denny, the last of the original settlers, died at the age of 88. Here on the right, an old Roland sits beside the Territorial University's columns with another pioneer, University history professor Edward Meany. Now Roland lies with the rest of Arthur and Mary Denny's family at Lakeview Cemetery. The Denny's impressive plot looks across to the vault of another university history professor, the recently deceased Giovanni Costigan. In 1853, during the second year of settlement, the Republican Arthur Denny and the Democrat David Doc Maynard made the city's first grids. Maynard below Yesler Way and Denny above it. When they couldn't agree where the streets should meet, the streets didn't meet. Later, Denny explained that this lack of uniformity in the city's first grid was the result of Maynard's appetite for spirits. In other words, that the doctor was drunk. While Arthur Denny might have been right in his diagnosis of Maynard's capacities that day, he was wrong in the conclusion that Maynard's inclinations were out of line with Seattle's. There are few cities with a topography as spirited as Seattle's. Built on 37 hills, its setting is so powerfully diverse, so powerfully drunk, that even a history of grids, regrades, and even Republicans could not smooth or straighten the imagination of this place. Now David and Catherine Maynard are buried at Lakeview's highest point, a stone's throw from Arthur and Mary Denny's statuary. The Maynards' plaques are hardly legible. They lie flat at the foot of the Maynard tree, where their bones no doubt are by now thoroughly entwined with the tree's roots, as much as with Seattle's.